So the Liver King's been busy.
Never!
For those of you not in the loop, Mr. King was a niche internet personality from 2022 whose rock and bod was built off the idea of consuming animal buttholes, liver, and sleeping on the floor. Now we fast forward a little bit, and at a surprise to absolutely no one, turns out that he'd been injecting a pharmacy worth of gear into his veins, and his career took, well, a hit. Fast forward even further, then rewind a little bit.
The Liver King was arrested in downtown Austin after making multiple terroristic threats on the life of Joe Rogan.
In today's build, in honor of the king himself, I'm making a model of the Liver King devouring his enemy, which, as of the 26th of June 2025, is Joe Rogan. So I'm going to make this in the style of this absolutely mental Francisco Goya painting. So here's the plan. I'm going to make this 6th scale, so I'm anticipating an overall height of around 9 to 12 inches, which is going to be a fairly big build for me. So onto a 3D printed base, I'm going to have the king devouring Mr. Rogan. Build up some scenery, call it a day.
Your art was the prettiest art of all the art.
2 beefy boys, 2 kings if you will, and 1 Goya-inspired model. Let's get to it. Now when it comes to 3D sculpting, I tend to do it over multiple passes and edits. Step 1, blocking out. Using a reference photo, I'm able to create the rough shape of the form. No need to go into any major details at this point, keeping things as low poly as possible. At this point, the main focus is on scale, making sure that the arms are the right size relative to hands, relative to body, and all that. For the sake of ease, I try to keep the body as symmetrical as possible. You just want to create something that roughly resembles a Sims 1 character. The time for torturing your old laptop with a high poly count is saved for later in the sculpt. With our beautiful blocky form done, time for part 2, the first pass. Now this is where those blocks get that first level of detailing. We do a remesh, so I can add any details, bony prominences, or any sort of large muscles, as well as any surface landmarks. At this point, try to take advantage of the use of symmetrical sculpting, especially while the model's still in its anatomical position. This saves a lot of time and maintains some of that symmetry. Now at the end of the first pass, we've got something passable for a human. And it's at this point, I duplicate the figure, and now we have the Liver King and Mr. Ivermectin himself. So now we can start on the faces, starting with a rough mesh just to make the head shape. After this, I carve out areas of the landmarks of the face, like the eyes and the nose. Then it's onto some lips and some of the rough facial folds. 2 symmetrical spheres make up the peepers, and we're left with something that's not very Liver King-y, but have faith, the dude is mostly facial hair anyway. Now on to Joe, a very similar process. I think the years of fighting have rendered his head into a really easy to sculpt block. And there we have the fellas, very sort of early form, base feature fellas. Now there's that point in every build where it's not looking exactly like you want, and you want to throw whatever it is that you're working on in the bin and then yourself into traffic, but trust the process. This was that point for me. At this point, I've got a rough idea of the shape, so I'll start bending and twisting the body into where I want everything for the final pass. I mostly use the pose and elastic deform tools. I'm very aware that if I do things like retopologizing, then I can create an armature, blah blah blah, but I don't want to do that. Life is short and learning things is hard. Once this is all posed, I can start by blending all the different parts of the build. Here I'm remeshing and blending any seams. Unfortunately, using the pose tool can often distort the body, so the elastic deform tool helps put anything back to where it should be, making sure everything looks sick. So now we're on to the finer detailing. I like to treat this as a final pass where I can start to add things like muscle striations, surface details, imperfections, and clothing. Now with the Liver King's insatiable appetite, today he's hungry for shoulder. So I've taken a big chomp out of Joe's torso with the arms discarded on the floor. To make things look nice and awful, a couple Taurus rings to make up some exposed ribs. This is probably the most time-consuming part, but it's also the most fun, and where trusting the process really pays off. This is the point where things finally start coming together and actually looking good. To make the Liver King actually look like a Liver King, I sculpted a beard, mustache, and a nasty set of gnashes. As for the discarded arm, I used a copy of one of the arms from the main build. Using a slice tool to take out a bite-sized chunk, I modelled a cylinder to make up a humorous bone-looking bone, and throw in a couple extra deep scratches to add to the ambiance. Finally, we're adding on the mustache and his luscious locks. I swear to God, dude, he must be onto something about eating all his organs that makes his coat just so luscious and full. Then I'm going to add a sphere, push and pull that bad boy around, rip it, chop it, bop it, to make it look like the flesh ripped from Rogues' shoulder. To tie this all together, a flattened cylinder to make up a Warhammer looking base, and pushing and poking another sphere to create a rock-shaped rock. This will also be the anchor point for the sculpt to attach to the base. And finally, before I forget, what kind of paranoid roided out freak would he be without some ropey veins and some fabulous fingernails for tearing apart his perceived enemies? Now, before sending the sculpt to the printer, I have to break down the model into more manageable, printable, and paintable sections. This involves cutting the model into parts, adding some pegs, slapping on a handful of Boolean modifiers to create a negative space in the connecting piece.
I think this just might be my Mexico.
And here she is, my latest monstrosity. After everything was printed, it was time for some snipping, filing, sanding, and touching up of small failures, which I used some Milliput before sanding all of that back. To get things ready for painting and priming, I tack on the printed parts with some hot glue onto some alligator clips. And then all the prints get a base coat of a dark grey primer. Why? Because I ran out of black. How? With an air gun. What? Huh? With the primer all dried, I started with the main paint. So I thinned down some skin tone with my air gun and some airbrush medium. Airbrushed on a few coats just for some decent coverage. Aim for a consistency that resembles a skin-coloured milk. Skinmilk, if you will. While the skin dries, let's get cracking on the base. Now I've got my printed ultra-realistic rock. I also harvested some free-range rocks and pebbles from the mean Melbourne streets, only to forever entomb them in a prison of glue, paint and resin. Try to find some rocks in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, just to keep the scene interesting. I glued the large rocks into place and filled in the blank spaces with the pebbles. To seal everything into place, I sprayed a light spritzing of alcohol, which helps break up the surface tension of the watered down Mod Podge. This also helps the glue flow a little easier. Don't be afraid to drench the base in this. Finally, a dusting of small basalt to fill in the even smaller gaps, and then once dried, another base coat to really lock everything into place. With that skin base coat all dried, it's good, but it's also quite a flat tone. I recently learned this trick from the Creative Collector's YouTube page. Thin down some yellow and red paint with water, like really, really thin. The skin then gets a healthy splash before wiping down immediately with some wet paper towel. You're trying to remove the majority of the paint here. In the end, you're left with a small amount of pigments in some of the recesses. Doing this adds a little bit of warmth to the skin. With the washes all dried, water down some of your base skin tone and squirt this over the skin on a very, very low PSI, like 5, which allows for some freckling and some imperfections. With the skin all done, let's get bloody. Corn red was great for this one. I base coated all the bloody and fleshy parts and all the deep scratches across the torso and the arm. Now, for argument's sake, getting your arm nibbled off would leave a lot more blood, but for the sake of not completely alienating myself through gore, I restrained myself a little bit. Next up, I watered down some Mornfang brown to make a wash to splash around the eyes, frown lines, and the mouth. Be sure to wipe off any extra, emphasizing some of the deep creases in the face. After that first wash was dried, I slapped on some black wash around the eyes. This was really good in showing off the eyelids and the teeth. Once those washes had dried, I base coated all the exposed bone with some wraith bone. With the bones all drying out, the Liver King's hair and beard get a few coats of Tamiya brown for a base coat. Now with those layers done, we're mostly onto washes at this point. I pin wash all the details in the severed arm, a heavy wash over the Liver King's lunge and the deep scratches, as well as the chunk of viscera hanging from the Liver King's mouth. I swear I've said Liver King about 600 times at this point. A heavy wash over the beard and the hair pulls out all of those details from the strands. As those washes all dry up, some Corax white over the whites of the eyes and the teeth. Finally, we finish off painting the trunks on these gentlemen and let all these washes and layers dry off. While we wait, the base gets a spray of paint. We're trying to get a bit of a gradient from a mud brown all the way up to a light grey, highlighting some of the tops of the rocks. Now, I fully appreciate the irony of painting the free-range rocks I found outside, only to make them look like real rocks, but I guess that's Hollywood, baby. I'm then going to give the beard and the hair a nice light brown dry brush. To make those abs and muscles pop, I pin wash some black wash around the muscle edges, keeping to the recesses so that they can pull in these areas. To blend them in a bit better, a Q-tip moistened with some white spirits will help remove any pigments in places where we don't want them. And this actually looked pretty sick in the end. I was super happy with this one. As far as Joe Ro's facial hair goes, we've got some fairly faint stubble, which is sort of difficult. The Warhammer YouTube page has a great video on this. I mixed up some black, grey and some flesh tone and heavily watered this down. Splashed it on the areas that I sort of want it, then wiped off with a paper towel. A wet Q-tip helps remove any of the stark lines where the pigments tend to settle. And it's finally that time. Bloodwash, baby. Just thin down some corn red and go nuts. Try to focus on the areas where the viscera meets the normal flesh, just to bloody it up a little bit and a little bit of hyperemia. A little bit of blood on the beard too, because he's a messy eater, of course. Then we're flicking a liberal dose of blood too, just because blood, I guess. To make things look extra glistening, grimy and moist looking, sacrifice an old paintbrush and apply a layer of UV resin to all the bloody and fleshy areas. This was my first time doing this, and to be honest, compared to a gloss varnish, this made things look way more moist. A quick flash of the UV light to cure, and that mostly finishes the paint job. To finish off the eyes, Rogan's getting a deathly administratum grey, with the Liver King getting a light blue iris. Keeping in mind, I'll be adding on the absolutely perfect asymmetrical pupils from his mugshot. Seriously dude, threatening to kill the biggest podcaster and showing up with one blown out pupil is so fucking tough. Now for the last of the washing, the Liver King's going to have some pretty messy hands from his snack, so a final wash over the fingers and blend into the skin, and that makes the paint job. To finish off the base, a few splodges of Mod Podge and tweezering in some flocking to make up some moss and some static grass for a bit of variety to the scenery. A few splashes of the thin down Mod Podge will then lock everything into place. Lastly, I did a dry fit of Rogan's arm, figuring out where it should have landed before a healthy squirt of the Bloodwash. So it was as I was putting the final touches on the piece that I realised that something was off. So I consulted the sacred texts.
So have you ever done DMT?
And he has tattoos, like arms covered. I was way too fixated on his wacky cold plunge nipples. Ah well. In the next daisy chain, I've got one for you Nintendo weirdos out there. I'm going to recreate this horrifying photo of bison poachers in the miserable Old West, but with Mario and Luigi and a whole bunch of Bowser skulls. Thanks for sticking around. If you've made it this far, be sure to like, subscribe, comment. Any little bit helps with the algorithm and getting more traction. Thanks for watching and see you on the next one.